Labor's Social Development Minister, Carmel Sepuloni, has been looking at debt the beneficiaries have racked up with WINZ, $417 million. She joins us now from our parliamentary office. Welcome to the program.
Hi, John.
You know, boy, this is complex, isn't it? Because some of these people are so damaged and they need care. And the issue is, how is that care provided when they can't afford private rents? Housing New Zealand in some cases has evicted them. What happens? What needs to be done?
Well, firstly, we need to know the full extent of the issue, and that's why I asked about the level of debt that Work and Income New Zealand clients are carrying. But unfortunately, when it comes to breaking it down, the response I get from the ministry is that they will not be investing the resource or time into separating out that data for us. So until we know how much money has actually been spent on motel accommodation as an emergency option, then we don't know the full extent of the problem.
And Tolly just clarified that. No one knows how much has been spent on emergency accommodation. The figures you've obtained say $470 million main beneficiary debt in total, but there is no breakdown of how much of that has been spent on emergency housing at these exorbitant rates.
No, that's right. And so, it's negligent of the government to say that actually they're not going to invest the time required or the resource required to give us that information, when actually that's in the public interest. When we hear about the government spending $1,500 a week on emergency accommodation for people in a motel, then we're concerned that actually that money could be better off spent elsewhere. But until we know the full extent of that debt, then we don't know how much money our government is wasting on the stopgap measure.
Okay, so someone turns up at a WINZ office, there is nowhere for them to live. They have children, and everyone that I've spoken to in emergency accommodation in the past week and a half has been in that emergency accommodation with children. What does WINZ do? Because as Antoli says, no decent society would turn those people away. What happens? What should happen?
Well, of course, what they do is they look for emergency housing options. And I know that in Auckland, there's an emergency accommodation tool that they use through Work and Income New Zealand, and that will pull up any vacancies in places. The problem at the moment is that the NGOs that, provide the more responsible types of emergency social housing are underfunded. They don't have the beds. We're contacting them from my electorate office to see whether they have spaces, and they don't. So people are then told, okay, here's an emergency accommodation option, here's a motel. Now, some families that we've spoken to have said that actually they'd rather sleep in their car than have that debt build up from staying in a motel, and so some of them are choosing to do that instead of taking up the motel.
So what needs to happen? What needs to happen that can realistically happen fast?
Well, what needs to happen first, because there's no silver bullet to this, but we need a government that takes the housing crisis seriously. They need to build affordable homes for first home buyers. They need to be investing in state housing instead of hocking it off. And I think, the minister's talking about the number of houses she says have been contaminated by P, but I think there are hundreds and thousands more, or hundreds more, or thousands more that have actually been sold off by the government, and that's the real issue. And they need to be investing in social housing. Until they do those three things, then we're not going to be addressing the housing demand that we have.
Look, I have a sneaky suspicion Anne Tolley, if she was listening, would be nodding away and saying, goodness gracious, I agree with you. But all of that's kind of medium to long term. In the short term, to deal with what seems on the face of it to be both a broad brushstroke crisis and an intense personal crisis for these people, what needs to happen?
The government needs to be responsible with regards to getting a grip of what the full extent of the problem is. So that's the biggest issue. How can they address it when they won't even provide us with the figures that we need to see the full extent of the problem? That's a really good starting point, actually.
Okay, and then when somebody turns up and Housing New Zealand won't take them because they seem to have a history with some P association, they have 8 children, they have no money, they are desperate, what gets done?
Well, going back to addressing the housing demand issues, John, but then of course looking for credible, responsible social housing options, including with emergency housing. We do have NGOs out there that are doing a good job but are severely underfunded, and we know that the $41 million that the government's invested is actually to actually fund them because they have been underfunded, but it's looking at what level of support they need to be able to address the need that's out there.